Well, thanks, Erin, for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. This time around, I get to ask the questions. I think that's only reasonable and fair.
I'm under the lamp this time.
So for people who obviously won't know you, can you share something about who you are and what you currently do?
Yeah, so I'm Erin Hutton. Used to be Erin Martin Sessions. So if you go look up anything I've published, it's all under another name, confusingly. I currently work for the Australian College of Theology. Prior to that, I worked at Morling College. So as I said, when I was interviewing Graham, we've had the privilege of working together twice, and we go to church together as well. I am an accreditant with the Baptist Association of New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory, so obviously in Australia. And I'm just shy of finishing my PhD. So apart from being an occasional church historian, most of my life revolves around family and trying to finish that PhD.
Which is on?
I get to say, okay. So even though I started out as a historian and occasional church historian, I've moved into Old Testament. So my PhD is on Song of Songs, and I'm looking at it in the hopes that it might aid us in our primary prevention of domestic and family violence.
Okie dokie. So that will find connections, I'm sure, in later conversation here. So
it does.
Yeah, when did you first become aware of this mob, as we would call them in Australia, this group of people known as the Anabaptists and Anabaptism?
Yeah, so you were there. So it would have been roughly 2005, and I had just started studying. And I think usually when you're learning church history, especially in a Protestant college that doesn't spend a whole lot of time on church history, we actually spent quite a bit of time on the Anabaptists, and I kind of wondered why that was, and then I realised what your thesis was on, and so I thought, that's why we're getting a pretty good look at the Anabaptists, and I liked what I heard. So that was my first time hearing about the Anabaptists. That was in church history in your class in around 2005.
There you go. I'm to blame for all of these things. So
credit or to blame, depending on how this goes.
Yeah. So how did you come to understand what Anabaptists are on about, rather than through my lens?
So what do I understand of Anabaptists rather than regurgitating Graham Chatfield? Yeah. Well, I think what I first kind of hung on to was the fact that Anabaptist was an insult, and I kind of like that the Anabaptists took it, reclaimed it, and went, yeah, okay, sure, that's what you're going to call us. That's what we are. And I think that kind of defiance and acceptance at the same time spoke to me. So that kind of got me thinking. That's how I kind of first understood Anabaptists, and then I kind of searched for a definition, because, like we were saying in your interview, it's, do we include Hubmaier? Do we not? What do we understand by this kind of movement, this group of people in the 16th century? And I kind of take a broad approach. I'm like, if you were baptizing adults in the 16th century, you're Anabaptist. I get that it's more complicated than that, but I thought that was kind of a simple, if we're going to get past this Gordian knot, that's how you do it. And then, I think, as you alluded to earlier, what I understand about Anabaptists is their non-violence. That's really important to me, as someone who's committed to non-violence themselves, and someone who studies violence now as part of their PhD and publishes on Bible and violence. I think that was one of the first things that really stood out to me, was the non-violence. And then I learned from there things like not swearing oaths. I think there disciplined discipleship. But so that's what I understand of Anabaptists.
So how would you put that together in terms of why commemorate 500 years since those people in Zurich first poured water over each other's heads?
For me, I think as a Baptist, it's about recognizing our baptizing forerunners and recognizing those connections. Recently, I started looking back into Anabaptists again, and that was kind of through the lens of our own association of Baptist churches. So as someone who's about to be accredited and ordained with this movement of people, I was saddened by some of the events that are happening in our association at the moment, and I thought that maybe some of the division we're experiencing might be explained by not knowing who we are and where we've come from. And so it was really important to me to know who we are and where we've come from and what we stand for and why and the cost of that. So I went back to the Anabaptists and looked at who they were and what they stood for and what they believed and the cost of that. So for me, it's really important to commemorate 500 years because people died for the beliefs that you and I hold so dear, and that I think that's something to be commemorated and to be remembered and even to be celebrated, that we're here, at least in part, because of people who had such strongly held beliefs around, I mean, obviously other things, but baptism. So yeah, I think for me, that's why it's important.
So non-violence, pretty important. How has that study of that aspect of Anabaptism contributed to your understanding of yourself as a Baptist or Baptist identity generally?
Yeah, I think so. There was a few things that I think, other than obvious adult baptism or believer's baptism, that I've kind of picked up from working to understand Anabaptists and seeing that reflected in my own and others around me, our Baptist identity. But there were other things I really appreciated about the Anabaptists as well. So I know that many of my Baptist brethren are committed to pacifism or non-violence, with some very carefully thought out exceptions. But I also see in my Baptist movement that we're a kind of decentralized, grassroots, almost spontaneous, because sometimes we argue about how we came to be, movement of just common folk. And that's really similar to the Anabaptists, who are this kind of spontaneous grassroots movement of common folk. I also liked that one of the first things I think you said in one of our lectures was that they agreed on almost nothing. I feel that in our Baptist movement, there's so much that we don't agree on, and yet we manage to come together because our faith is expressed through love, which is also an Anabaptist ideal. Their true faith is expressed in deeds of love. It's not love as this kind of wishy-washy feeling. It's love in action, kindness in action, charity in action, and aiming to follow in the footsteps of Christ. And for me, that's the heart of being Baptist. So yeah, there was quite a few ways that I think that studying the Anabaptists has influenced my Baptist identity. But similarly, those are the things that attracted me to studying the Anabaptists. Is I saw things that I held as my own Baptist identity. I think I saw, like in a mirror, reflected in the Anabaptists.
with a few little bits of mirror darkly thrown in.
Yeah, look, I definitely don't want to skip over some of the things where I perhaps don't agree with Anabaptists, or to, to throw under the rug some of the not so great things about either from the 16th century or the tradition. But yeah, I think truth telling, being predestinarian, that was pretty high up on the list as well. Yeah, I like that they differed from Luther and Calvin there.
Okay, we lost you for some of that most important distinctive stuff. So we'll have to go back and find the edited version, and we'll get a voiceover or something to fit it in. In the meantime, well, not sure if that was providential. In the meantime,
was it predestined?
Yes, providential or predestined. Yes, we could get into the theology of these things. What about some reading for us, Erin? Something simple to start with.
I think, but before I get to the reading, because I think the reading will make more sense if I talk about some of the specific things that I've been looking into lately. So I did kind of come back to looking at the Anabaptists again recently because of what's happening in our Baptist movement, but also because I was hoping to get a Festschrift off the ground, and I thought, where are the women? Which is often my thought. Where are the women? And then I realized that a lot of what I like about the Anabaptists comes together in the person of Margaret Hottinger. So I started looking into her a bit. And I wanted to tell a little bit of a story about her. So she's where, I guess, kind of the spiritualist side of the Anabaptists, and then my, I guess, feminist concerns kind of intersected in this one really interesting figure. So she was arrested in November of 1525, along with a few others, for being Anabaptists, as things kind of amped up in Zurich. She was thrown in jail, treated much the same as the men who were thrown in jail. They were starved. They had only hay to sleep on. She was arrested with kind of the who's who of the Swiss Anabaptists or Swiss Brethren. So people like Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz, George Blaurock, Ulrich Teck, Michael Sattler, and Martin Link. But it was Sattler and Link that specifically at the same time they were asked, so Margaret was asked to recant at the same time as them. Those two men, who went on to be notable and influential leaders of the movement, recanted, but Margaret didn't. She was stubborn and recalcitrant and determined, and that speaks to me. So here's what she said. So the court recorded her this way. She holds infant baptism to be incorrect and rebaptism to be right. Likewise, she asked my lords that they prove infant baptism to her. If they can prove to her that infant baptism is correct, then she'll desist. I love that. So 6 months go by and she finally decides to recant. But she doesn't say the words. They're written down by someone else, read out to her, and she reluctantly agrees. So she's released, but not obedient. She obviously continues to go about her rebaptizing business. And as the kind of persecution amps up, she tries to flee to Moravia. She's arrested along the way. So there is one source that I hope it's not apocryphal, that describes what she said when they were drowning her. They pull her out of the water and ask her to recant one last time. And she says, "Why did you pull me out? The flesh was almost defeated." So there is much to love about the Anabaptist movement. There's much to love about the strong, stubborn women in the Anabaptist movement who used the power and the authority and the means that they had available to them to serve and to lead and to be a part of that movement. So I think that kind of informs some of the more advanced reading that I would recommend. But I'll go back and start with, if you're less familiar with Anabaptism, where to start. Yeah. So I remember early on reading like an introductory book by Arnold Snyder. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember. I remember it had an introduction in the, so it was Anabaptist History and Theology, an introduction. Yep. But it's only fairly recently that I realised he also did another book that's in this kind of spiritual tradition series, and it focuses on the more kind of spiritual side of the Anabaptists. So it will still talk about their theology, their practices, some of the apocalyptic side of things, or non-violent swearing of oath, all the kind of things that we're familiar with, but it draws out their spirituality and that kind of more monastic tradition that stayed with the Anabaptists, or what Luther referred to as monkery, which my children giggle at to no end when I was telling them about this because it sounds like monkey. So that's been entertaining for them. But so I think that one's a good introductory text. So following in the footsteps of Christ, the Anabaptist tradition. If you wanted to get a bit more specific, the same author, Snyder, wrote with Linda Hubert Hecht. It's a Profiles of Anabaptist Women, 16th century reforming pioneers. So kind of similar to the book you recommended. There are some biographical sketches and more information about the women in the movement. And then there's also an article that I was reading recently. So Snyder's is, I think it's from the 90s, around 96 as well. But more recently, 2017, 2018, is David Wilgren's Women, Power and the Bible in Early Anabaptist History. So that one's kind of a little bit more through a feminist lens. And then I recognize that I've mentioned a couple of times the more apocalyptic kind of side of things. So if you wanted to look in to a not so sympathetic reading of that apocalyptic tradition, there's Norman Cohn's classic, The Pursuit of the Millennium. And then if you wanted to read something that's directly against that's a much more recent treatment that I found really interesting, was in Nova Religio, there's Michael Dryger's Thinking Inside the Cages, Norman Cohn, Anabaptist Munster, and polemically inspired assumptions about apocalyptic violence. So that also ties in with some of the biblical violence that I've been looking at, and my commitment to non-violence. So that's kind of a bit more details.
Yes. Interesting also, sort of clue in the title there. Thinking Inside the Cages, I suspect relates to the cages where the Anabaptist leaders were hung out in Munster, yeah?
Yeah. The title gives you exactly what it's talking about. But I also feel like, where would I be if I didn't spell out this further reading? So I'm just going to embarrass you. But I actually do highly recommend you go and read Balthasar Hubmaier and the Clarity of Scripture, which is Graham's PhD thesis, then published in book form.
Well, thank you for the last thing. I'm not sure you'll get much out of the royalty sales for that, but
you're not going to edit it out. What?
But thanks for your time, Erin, and sharing your insights, particularly coming at it from the women of the Reformation, the radical that that's great to have some interesting reading out there for people to follow up. So thanks very much for that, and no
You're
doubt
very welcome.
I'll see you at church, as they say.
Yeah, see you next Sunday.